Over the last 40 years, great work has been done in the fields of song collecting and music collecting, but there is still one aspect of Irish culture which has been almost totally neglected, that is the field of balladry. I don't mean by balladry the field of song, but the field of poetry. Musicians are never called local musicians. They are either fiddle players or box players, and so on. In Ireland, however, we have made a peculiar distinction. We have poets and we have local poets. The poets are those writers who appear in literary magazines, publish collections, and are mentioned by the critics, and who are educated in the developments of poetry in the 20th century. The local poets are not professionals. They seldom publish their work. They write about local events. They are firmly rooted in 19th century verse forms. They don't worry about identity or life or love or any of the big themes that begin with capital letters. As a result, they are not accepted by the arbiters of literary taste. This is understandable up to a point. They have heard of rather than read the poems, and I must admit many of those poems are very bad indeed. But here and there were and are good local poets to be found. The amount of good poetry, however, of that type cannot be ascertained until it is all collected. Unfortunately, nobody seems to be about that work. Well, if these local poets do not deal with mainstream themes, what do they deal with? They commemorate hurling matches, football matches, disasters, and they usually write badly when dealing with these themes. The ballads they produce are virtually interchangeable. Just a few names need to be changed here and there. But when they deal with humorous themes, or when they satirise, they can be brilliant. They form then an unbroken line which stretches back into the Gaelic past, especially into the 18th century. The professional poets even then, such as O'Bruder, Davy O'Bruder, who was born, as legend has it, in County Limerick and at least worked in the area, he despised the local poets, the Stroid Éigshe, he called them, the street poets. Danny Barry of Newcastle West was an example of the local poet at his best. He died in 1973. He is still remembered with a shudder by many of the people he attacked in his verse. Well, I shouldn't say attacked. That implies a helpless victim. He mocked the foolish, the vain, the craw, thumper, the jack-in-office, the bogus patriot. Many of his poems are lost. Mere scraps of them are still retained in people's memories. Some of the surviving verses are still libellous, but the trouble with poetry is, no matter how vicious, how scandalous, how libellous, it becomes public property once distributed, whether by word of mouth or slipped under people's doors early in the morning. It becomes the poet's gift and the poet's curse. Of course, Danny Barry did not only write satire. Like all Irish poets, he was in love with places, and his verses are full of place names. But these poems happen also to be his weakest poems. He fell heavily into an almost cloying sentimentality, made more syrupy by echoes from Robert Service and Thomas Moore. His poems indicate a passionate attachment to 19th century rhyme schemes and to the comfortable clichés. But a rural audience expects rhyme and even clichés. These devices, to them, establish the fact that they are listening to poetry and to a poet. Indeed, without these formulas, the audience would simply reject both poetry and poet, because to them, and rightly so, poetry is not a rarefied exercise of the intellect, but a ritual expression in which the whole community can share. The simplest device used by the local poet to capture his reader's attention is the use of place names. Danny Barry's piece about Glenastar, which is a local beauty spot, which contains a magnificent waterfall of nearly 100 feet high, embodies both his charm and his faults. A genuine love for the area married to a weak sentimentality. Softly, O Dar, be the roar of the fall, wake not the slumbering glen, wake not the spirit asleeping there of the Fenian fighting men. Wake not them now, O mighty fall, wake not them now, but defend. You have lulled them to sleep for many a year. let them sleep to the song of the wind. The flatulence and the influence of Tom Moore is echoed here, but again the people were familiar with Tom Moore's verses. They expected a poet to work in that way. And again, in his verses called My Newcastle West, the same things are evident. There is an old town by the setting sun, it is called Newcastle West, my hometown where I was born and the place that I love best. The mountains by are wide and high to guard my valley home, in the golden vein of the Arravale, my Newcastle West. Boher Bui, once of gaiety, now a street of forgotten men, and Maiden Street where old friends meet but will never meet again. The nursery and the majors and things that we love best are gone and gone forever in my Newcastle West. For there is no hill like Rooska Hill, nor glen like Glenastar, nor river like the Ara, no water like the Dar. Cullen Moor and Lover's Lane, a place to sit and rest, and the sweetheart shy all pass me by in my Newcastle West. This poem is weak, I grant that, and it is loaded with local references, but as in the piece on Glenastar, the poet breaks through the tangle of sentimentality and comes up with lines like, you have lulled them to sleep for many a year, let them sleep to the song of the wind, and he talks about a street of forgotten man. This raises the verse above the common and indicates that Danny Barry was more than a mere cataloguer of place names. His real strength lay in his satires, or in those poems in which he dealt with people. In a poem of his called The Old School, he describes a teacher called Musgrave. There are slight echoes of Goldsmith here, but the poem is firmly rooted in the 18th century Anglo-Irish ballad tradition, in such songs as the Limerick Rake. This is a verse from The Old School. Gone is J.P. Musgrave, a gentleman was he, a student of prognosis, he could tell what was to be. 'Twas often said he was severe, he made them face the wall, but he was a man of progress, he made scholars of them all. And there was Master Ambrose, as George he was better known, for nicknames and for wisdom, of superiors he had none. There was no one could afford to miss, for he had an awful saying, you better brush it up, my boys, 'cause you have sawdust for a brain. He christened many a pupil from his lofty rostrum stool, and no one knew his own name at the old country school. Well, now there, Danny Barry uses words and misuses words which only a master of verse in the 18th century could have done. I love the expression, a student of prognosis. His poem, The Christmas Tree, deals with an actual happening. A few men from Maiden Street in Newcastle West decided to erect a Christmas tree in the street. They cut it down in Glenmageen, an area reputed to be haunted by a witch known as Spridnabarna, which is about 4 miles south of Newcastle West. She, the witch, the Sprid as she is called, or Sprig, sometimes mispronounced, was greatly feared by the local people. Indeed, up to recently, up to 20 years ago, only a few tough men would go home along the road she haunted after dark. Danny Barry's simple evocation of Sprid and her victims is extraordinary, not because it is great poetry, but because he does not question the truth of the event at all. By the way, the Silver Dollar Saloon, with its strange Hollywood or Western type name, is a pub in Newcastle West, which was then run by the Flynn family and is now run by the Kelly family, one of whom is a Flynn. The poem is called The Christmas Tree. And again I mentioned Robert Service, and it's evident the metre, even the introduction, is pure Service. A bunch of the boys from Maiden Street one Wednesday afternoon were drinking and awaiting in the Silver Dollar Saloon, waiting for a lorry to convey them to Glenmageen, and they brought from there a Christmas tree, the finest ever seen. They put it up in splendour, bedecked with fairy lights. It was a wonderful tree, a beautiful tree that lightened the darkest night. Now the festive season passed away, but this Christmas tree was there to stay. In time it became the talk of the town, for none of the boys dared take it down. They were stricken with a malady the doctors could not say, and there is one poor chap who now resides at the back of Shaw's today. Now you have heard of Spridnabarna, that very naughty dame, that evil maid of Glenmageen, of the haunting ghostly fame. The clergy had to banish her between the bark and the tree. No more she would haunt and terrify the neighbours of the tree. Now the moral of this ditty I want you all to know. It was a tree that grew in Glenmageen 20 years ago. And what I am trying to tell you, will cause you all to frown, that the Omadawns from Maiden Street has brought the spirit to town. And when the blackthorn blooms again and the sheepdogs howl at the full of moon, you may meet the spirit with a glass of gin in the Silver Dollar Saloon. Danny Barry perhaps wrote a couple of 100 poems, many of them now lost or mouldering in the cupboards of his victims. The handful I speak about here I got from his daughter Mary Flanagan. I hope this programme will encourage people in Newcastle West to supply Mary or myself with more material with a view to publishing it. I can naturally understand the reluctance of people to expose themselves or their relations to literature. But as I said, poetry is public property and should be published. I believe the best poem Danny Barry wrote, at least the best poem that has come to my hands, is a piece called The Eviction. Again, it is based on an actual happening. It is full of irony and humour, and of course the elemental Irish hate for landlords, sheriffs and bailiffs is very evident. My name is Peter Shea, my age is 57. The old dock road was my abode, a station next to heaven. I was happy as an angel, with my lot I was content, but I took to drinking porter, and I could not pay the rent. So now to all good neighbours, a sad tale I must state. I was forced to go from my bungalow beside the Sandpit Gate. Tom Hartnet was my landlord, and a damn bad one was he. I only owed him 6 years' rent, when he kindly summoned me. I tried to calm his temper, but I could not calm old Tom, so to ease the situation I took in sweet Maggie Nom. Poor Maggie was so gentle and mild in her debate that she won my heart, and I lost my house beside the Sandpit Gate. 'Twas on a fine September morn, the year was 31, the sheriff came and flung me out, myself and Maggie Nom. As he called to his head bailiff, "Is there any more to go?" I said, "Wait a while, your honour, sir, you forgot poor Maggie's Poe." And when he raised the lid off, in candour I must state, I smothered all the neighbours that lived round the Sandpit Gate. So now to finish up my rhyme, there's one thing I must say about the smiling face and the charming grace of my darling Gorky Shea. For when the world frowned at me, she did not hesitate with me to stay and perhaps to lay down by the Sandpit Gate. If you compare this poem with the hundreds similar to it, which were written in Munster in the Irish language 200 years ago, it is easy to see the link between, say, Sean O'Toma and Danny Barry. The same love of place, of the cherished phrase, of galloping metres and tumbling rhyme. The same disregard for the very thin skins of the fool and of the oppressor. And amazingly enough, they had the same effect. Danny Barry could frighten his enemies by a threat of public laughter. And remember, he died as recently as 1973, in his early 60s. I knew him, of course, but I doubt if we spoke about poetry more than once. It often happens that such poets as Danny Barry are wary of college-educated smart alecks, knowing that young men full of newfangled notions of verse have little time for versifiers of Danny's ilk. Yet he achieved what all poets try to achieve. He wrote for his people. He was recognised as a poet. He could make his people laugh or sing or tremble. And he was well aware of the fragility of his attempts. He said in one of his little poems called Remembrance, "And so it will be when he is gone, someone will sing of him in song, someone will read what he held dear, but too late for praise he will not hear."